What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a recap of the final panel from Hell for Baldur's Gate 3, which gave us some important information about the launch version of the game that is coming August 3rd, at least for PC. That said, I want to mention right at the top of this video that the early access period right now did not receive an update, which has been the case for previous panels of Hell. They would show something off and then immediately update the early access. I would imagine that the reason that was not the case here is because what they are showing is for the launch version of the game, which is less than a month away. That said, everyone who has purchased early access already should see an update, I believe 72 hours ahead of the game's official release, where you'll get to play through the first act or so of the official game, as opposed to the early access version. But from there, let's jump into the rest of this. This show wound up being about 3 hours long due to some technical difficulties, but nonetheless, we still have a lot to cover. Some stuff I'll be talking about, some stuff I will kind of gloss over due to spoilers or just things YouTube doesn't like you talking about, frankly. But a lot of the early part of the show focused on their revamped character creation. First and foremost, you'll notice that it looks a lot different than the current one in early access. This is to make all of your options a little bit clearer while also giving you visual representation of the cosmetic options for your character. So if you're clicking through hairstyles, you can actually see the hairstyles, that kind of thing, in addition to just general UI updates. But this does come with a lot of new options for individual characters as well. For instance, tieflings will be able to determine the color and shape of their horns a little more. You can pick body types for your character now, so they can be really scrawny or medium sized or a more muscular build, that type of thing. So body types will be coming with the launch version. But then we got the other interesting details. Obviously, they showed off the half-orc and the dragonborn, which will be races coming to us in launch, which get their own unique versions as well. Dragonborn in particular got a lot of effort put into making them visually appealing with a lot of customization options for their scales and adding pearlescence effects even. But one thing in particular that really stood out to me there is that if you are playing a sorcerer with the draconic bloodline, you get a few extra cosmetic options for that, which was a nice touch. That said, as races, Dragonborn get access to their dragon lineage, which will give them resistances to damage types based on the type of color dragon they are, alongside a breath weapon, which has its damage type determined by the same thing. Then we have half-orcs, which are notoriously difficult to kill. Once per day, when brought to the dying status, they can instead just have 1 HP, which makes them both very versatile. We also got some official talk about respec and multiclassing. Respec, you'll be able to find a character that will just do this for you. You'll be able to respec. And the reason that they're letting you do this in a free-form manner, they say, is specifically to facilitate the multiclassing that is coming. Basically, in D&D 5e, not all of the multiclassing options are exactly balanced, so they want people to be able to play around with that freely and find something that works for them. So with that in mind, you'll be able to change your classes and basically just reset your character's class in its entirety. If you're unaware, in D&D 5e, when it comes to leveling up, I like to think of it as a class point system, where basically every character level you gain, you earn 1 class point that you can then put into any class you want, which is effectively how you multi-class. You just put points in multiple classes. Sometimes these combinations work, sometimes not so much. And while we didn't see a ton of examples in the showcase of this, that is essentially how it's going to work here as well. The one thing they really wanted to get across when it came to character creation is reactivity of this character in the world. Basically, if you pick something, even if it's really obscure, they want it to be represented and reacted to by the game. So if you make, one example they had was a Gith druid, that's odd and people are going to comment on it. In fact, they had a team whose job it was to go through the game and specifically work on dialogue and things like that, with an example they gave being that Act 1 got like 33% more dialogue based on that specifically. So they really wanted to focus in on the reactivity to your choices in character creation. But from there, they moved on to talking about the origin characters. A few things in particular. For starters, when the game actually releases, you'll be able to play as the origin characters. That's the point of the origin character system, which was present in Divinity Original Sin 2. Basically, the origin characters are pre-generated characters for the most part that have a very specific story that ties into the main plot somehow. So when you're actually playing as the origin characters, you'll be able to make decisions about how that plays out. Whereas if they are just in your party, for instance, they'll more than likely act in a set way most of the time outside of your own influence on their character. But nonetheless, we still have some more interesting information to talk about here in regards to origin characters. For starters, we got the reveal of the brand new one following a sort of murder mystery thing they were doing online up to this point to reveal the Dark Urge. The Dark Urge is a really interesting take on an origin character because it is the only origin character that is not a predefined character, so to speak. It is rather a story that you'll attach to a custom character. So you'll make a character like normal in that it is customizable, it can be any race or class combo you want, but the origin story for this character is that you've been granted this dark urge to murder and maim everyone you see, which makes this a prime candidate for the murder hobo option, though technically that option is available to everyone. But this character woke up with no memories, they don't know who they are, where they come from, they just have an extreme urge to kill, and their story is going to be about resisting this or leaning into it and finding out where it comes from. So as far as origin characters go, it's very unique, and I'll probably talk a little bit more about this in its own video because it's just a very odd origin character, though it does seem like the default appearance for this is a white dragonborn, but it is customizable. Nonetheless, though, we also got some more interesting information here as well. For starters, we got the other recently revealed origin character, Karlach, a tiefling barbarian who fought in the Blood War in the first layer of Hell, Avernus. She has an infernal heart. That is to say, she's been modified in some way where her heart is not her original one. This is why she is like literally spouting flames out of her body to some degree, based on how worked up she gets. This plays into her origin story as well as her events and things around her, as there will be times she is very literally on fire. That said, she is a good character. Her intentions and goals are good aligned, so to speak. Which is interesting because her appearance in Early Access, this is a character we could already meet, she just wasn't available to join our party, actually has one of the more interesting quests in Early Access, so it'll be interesting to see that play out over the course of the game with her in particular. Now, another thing they mentioned that really stood out to me is that one of our origin characters we've had access to already, Will, is getting a rework. We won't be able to see this until launch, of course, but basically Will was the least popular of the origin characters, so they decided to change that up a little bit. His story, which they thought was already interesting, didn't really come into its own until much later in the game, so they decided to bring that up to speed faster, and they did this by rewriting a lot of it, with one of the key things they wanted people to know is that he and Karlach will want to kill each other. How you handle that and what comes of it is ultimately down to you as a player, but out of the gate, Will and Karlach will be very murderously opposed to one another, which I thought was cool. Speaking of this, though, we also got another rehashing of the recently announced companions. These are companions that will be able to join your party, but won't be playable characters you could play the game as, just regular old companions. These are Halsin, the druid from Early Access, Jaheira, which is a previous companion from the other games, just like Misc will be as well. And then lastly, Minthara, which is, again, already in Early Access and a character you can meet. In addition to origin characters and companions, though, we will have access to Hirelings, as they described them. There will be 12 of these, one representing each available class in the game, that you can then customize however you want. So the subclass, their appearance and everything, that's up to you, but there are 12 Hirelings, one for each class, that you'll be able to take along and customize. Then they went on to talk about romances very in-depth. I'm going to gloss over this a little bit, simply because what they showed is not something I can put on YouTube, and in fact, during the show, they mentioned that their own TikTok account got banned for showing what they showed. But they spent a lot of time talking about the romances in the game and how they wanted them to feel authentic, where both you and the other character in said romance grow and change over the course of the game and try to work that out through a difficult situation. Now, romance in games is touchy. It's one of those things where it's hard to pull off correctly just because a video game simply isn't representative of the real thing. So the quality of this will ultimately come down to user engagement, I would say, and how well some of the stuff they talked about pans out, but their intentions seem well placed here. From there, we went on to get a look at more of the city of Baldur's Gate, which came with a few notes of interest. We saw an introduction to a few characters I don't want to mention due to spoilers. We might talk about that separately, but they did give us a pretty good look at some of the lower city, in particular of Baldur's Gate, showing off some iconic locations from said city, which was pretty cool to see. And they talked a lot about how they wanted the city to feel alive, and that what they planned for characters and things speaking in the streets was to talk about recent events, which will of course involve things the player has been getting up to. There's a newspaper system that will do something similar, which is kind of a cool way to learn about the world without actually having to speak to every individual character, but you can also do that if you wanted to, which sounded pretty cool. From there, they went on to talk about combat a little bit, specifically the difficulty options they have in mind. They talked about this previously during an update, so I don't have much to add here, but basically they're adding, in addition to the current early access version, which is just normal difficulty, they're also adding a difficulty called Explorer and Tactician. Explorer is story mode, it's easy, you just want to see the narrative, talk to the characters, that kind of thing. Tactician will significantly overhaul combat encounters to make them more difficult, and essentially you'll need to be very familiar with the system and the game to succeed. They also showed off a lot of the upcoming monk class, some of which they substantially house ruled to make sure it feels more impactful, but basically this character will be able to do martial arts or be a shadow monk, which will allow them to be a more stealthy character, which will get an ability called Shadow Strike to allow them to teleport and stealth behind enemies and do sneak attacks. Then there is the Way of the Four Elements, which allows them to cast versions of spells in addition to their melee abilities. So it seems like the monk will be a good character. They also showed off some split-screen local co-op. It looks like they were doing this on console, so I think they were showing us a bit of the console UI at the same time, which we haven't really seen up to this point, or at least much of, which was kind of interesting, but basically the game will have local split-screen co-op even on PC. Then they went on to talk about the story and cinematics of the game. One thing I actually really liked here, because I mentioned it in my video talking about some of their recent updates, is that their claims about 174 hours of cinematics, I believe it was worded a little bit oddly, and they cleared a lot of that up during this show, which I appreciated. Mostly they were just confirming what everyone was already assuming, but again, it was worded weird, and that the 174 hours of cinematics includes cinematic dialogue. So when you're talking to a character, but the characters are like animated and doing things and they are involved in the scene unfolding, they are counting that in that time, alongside all of the permutations of that, which is how they get to that number. So if you were concerned about having to watch just like tons of cinematics back to back, no, that's not what they're going for at all. That said, they did a bit of a deep dive into their cinematic team and what building that up from the ground basically looked like, as they didn't have one prior to this game. And there was a lot of cool information about that as well, and some of the things the team members worked on, which they seemed really proud of, so I wanted to mention it specifically. Now, from there, they showed off a few more things, but some stuff I don't really want to talk about too much due to spoilers. They went on to show off the Collector's Edition, but then they also showed some very spoiler-heavy stuff from Act 2 of the game, so immediately following what we have access to in Early Access, which was really cool to see, but full of spoilers, so I don't want to talk about it in this video. We did get a few answers about a few different things in that section, however, I might talk about it separately, or you could just go watch the end of that live stream yourself if you're really curious about that part in particular, as it was pretty cool. I do want to mention a little bit about some of the subclasses they talked about. They didn't go over this a ton, so I wanted to separate it out from the other part of the video, but they talked a little bit about some of the subclasses they announced that were coming to the launch version, which were new, which was cool, but they specifically mentioned that some of the subclasses won't actually be available right away in character creation, but rather due to narrative reasons, you would have to unlock them during gameplay, which is how it works in the tabletop for some of them. They specifically mentioned the Gloomstalker Ranger as one of these, and from memory, I believe there is a Paladin one as well. I want to say it was the Oathbreaker, though that wasn't part of the show, that was just previous knowledge. So my point is, even during character creation, it's important to keep in mind that there will be important class choices potentially that are tied to the game and not the character creation screen, which is really cool to see, but deserved a note here at the end. That said, that is pretty much all of the important highlights of this particular panel from Hell, and now that we know like the full scope of what the launch version of a lot of things is going to look like, I'll be covering that over the course of July, talking about a few things that they talked about in this show, as well as their current representation in early access, things like classes, the origin characters, stuff like that. But with less than a month away from the full launch of this game, it is shaping up to be a really great game just by the looks of everything they've shown off, and I'm very excited for it. I did want to mention real quick before we finally wrap this up though, that they mentioned they were struggling with the marketing when it comes to marketing this game because there is so much to it, they're not quite sure what angle to approach it from. which I just thought was really cool because you don't see developers talk candidly about that kind of thing much of the time. And as someone who used to do a lot of like sales type work before I did YouTube full time, I find stuff like that interesting, but just something I wanted to note. That though is going to do it for this video. That was basically everything shown off at the panel from Hell, which was a really good showcase. And if you're looking forward to any of this stuff or the launch version or anything else you want to talk about, don't forget to leave it down in the comment section below, which of course means like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.